We're in Richmond, Virginia at one of the sites for the American Civil War Museum in the Flag Vault. Today we're focusing on the museum's flag collection, which so far as I know is the largest collection of Civil War related flags in the world. We have more than 700 flags. Of those, about 550 are full-sized Civil War era flags, and the majority of those are Confederate, but we do have some Union flags as well. The Confederate States of America formed in March of 1861, and one of their first orders of business was to select a design for their national flag. The flag that we're looking at here is one example of that flag pattern. This is known as the first national flag because the Confederacy would ultimately go through 3 different designs. This one looks very reminiscent of the United States national flag. That was done on purpose because many Southerners had served in the United States Army or otherwise felt strong affection for the old Union, and so they didn't want to completely dispense with many of the symbols and emblems of the United States. So rather than having 13 stripes, they simply had 3, red, white, red, and then 1 star for each state that was officially part of the Confederacy. Because Southern states were leaving the Union and joining the Confederacy throughout the spring of 1861, the number of stars started out at 7 and ultimately went up to officially 11, although sometimes they would also actually include as many as 13 or even 15, which very optimistically was including places such as the Arizona Territory or Southern California. This particular flag was carried as a battle flag by a regiment that was in the 3rd Florida Infantry. This was the flag that was carried by Company D. And at the war's outset, every company that was part of a regiment did have their own flag. But this ultimately resulted in a lot of confusion on the battlefield as companies had a wide variety of the different types of flag patterns that they were carrying. And it was ultimately decided after the Battle of First Manassas or First Bull Run in July of 1861 that all of the company flags were to be sent home and each regiment would be issued 1 official battle flag. Each Confederate Army selected a different design as the flag that it would carry. So this particular design is known as the Army of Northern Virginia flag pattern. This would have been carried by every regiment that was fighting under General Robert E. Lee throughout the war. Other generals who were in charge of other armies could basically pick whatever flag pattern that they wanted. A rectangular version of this has become what most of us today consider to be the quote-unquote Confederate flag. But at the time, this square pattern was the one that would have been carried only by regiments that were serving under General Lee. This particular one was chosen by the Army of Northern Virginia because it was actually submitted as a design by someone who had studied flag design and the elements of good flag design. So for instance, the fact that there's a white edge that goes in between the red and the blue portions, which kind of helped to give a little bit of a visual distinction. That was very important. This particular flag has been marked in the center with what we call a unit designation. So this was carried by the 47th Virginia Infantry. And in each of the red areas on the flag, you can see that there are what are referred to as battle honors. And the regiment would have somehow decided which battles that they felt were worth remembering. So these would have been notable battles for them. What's notable about a lot of these flags is that they were often captured by Union soldiers. So the number that you see stenciled here on the part of the flag that would have been attached to the flag staff is referred to as a War Department capture number. So this flag actually was captured in battle. It was captured just a few days after the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, and it was turned in to the United States War Department because capturing a flag was one of the ways that a Union soldier could receive a Medal of Honor. And the War Department kept record of all of the flags which were turned into them, and they would also capture such information as the date that the flag was captured and who had captured it. On the Union side, each regiment typically carried 2 flags. They had a regimental flag as well as a United States national flag. This flag here is one example of the variety of regimental flags that could have been carried in the Union Army. Sometimes they also would carry basically a large version of their state flag, but this was this became the much more common version with this federal eagle grasping the arrows and the olive branch in its claws. Had the regiment that carried this particular flag had it for very much longer, they probably would have had their regiment's name written onto this red banner. But we know that they didn't have a chance to carry it for very long. This was actually captured by soldiers in the Confederate Army, and so this flag remained in private hands in the South until it was donated to the museum in the early 1920s. Now, in the case of the South, captured flags would have been sent to Richmond, and Richmond, of course, burned in the evacuation fire in April of 1865. So any flags that had been captured by Confederate soldiers and were turned in to the Confederate States War Department probably were destroyed in that fire in 1865. So it's only flags that were captured and not sent in officially, things that were sent back home or were kept by those soldiers until they themselves returned home, that managed to survive. This is an example of the United States national flag that would have been carried as well as the regimental banner. This particular one is kind of interesting because it was issued to the 1st Regiment Maryland Volunteers. Maryland, being a border state, had regiments that fought for both sides during the war, and it's, I believe, the only state that actually had a 1st Maryland United States and a 1st Maryland Confederate States regiment. And there was one notable battle in which they actually faced off against each other, which was the Battle of Front Royal in 1862, and that's actually where this particular flag was captured. Being a color bearer was a difficult job, not only because the size of these flags, but because you couldn't really carry a weapon simultaneously. So you were essentially making yourself a big target. So being a color bearer during the war on either side was definitely a big honor. And there are numerous battles where we have stories of color bearers who are shot down and another person stepping forward to take the colors and carry them forward. Having a flag captured was considered basically a terrible thing, and if there was virtually any men left in the regiment who were able to pick up the colors and carry it forward, then they would. So having a flag captured essentially became a symbol that that regiment had been all but decimated during a particular battle. This is another flag with a really interesting story behind it, and you've probably noticed that there's only half of the flag here. This flag was donated to us just a few years ago, actually, by a woman who was a descendant of a Union soldier who served in the 43rd Indiana Infantry. And he participated in Sherman's March, so he would have been going through Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina in 1864 and 1865. The story that was passed down through her family along with this flag is that he and another soldier went into a barn, and they believed that it was in South Carolina, and found this flag hidden there. And they proceeded to argue over who was going to get to keep the flag. So their solution was to cut it in half, and each of them was going to keep one half of the flag. So fortunately for us, the portion that her ancestor kept does have a partial unit nickname or designation on it, which says means light infantry. And so through our research, we've been able to determine that that is Company F of the 12th South Carolina Infantry. So it's really unfortunate that this beautiful silk flag with this very nice oil painted design, which actually features a flag itself right there in the center, that only half of it still survives. But I cross my fingers that the descendants of the other Union soldier may still have the other bottom half of it somewhere. This is a flag that's in a completely unique design that, as far as we know, this is the only surviving example of this flag, and probably there was never another one made that quite looked like this. The women from a town called Gordonsville, Virginia, made this flag and presented it to. After that battle, they had captured several Union soldiers who told them that they thought that the unusual design of this flag meant that the Confederate troops meant to fight to the bitter end, essentially meaning that they did not intend to take any prisoners, which was not the intent of the Confederates who were carrying this flag. So we don't know if it was this X on this blue field or this starburst or what it was that gave the impression that that's what this flag meant. But it was certainly a message that made the Union troops fight really, really hard during that battle. And since the Confederates hadn't intended to send that particular message, and certainly didn't want every other Union regiment which they encountered to think the same thing and put up such a grueling fight, they decided to set this aside and not use it again. The museum strives to preserve all of these flags for future generations to be able to study and enjoy. Before a flag can be conserved professionally, our first step is simply to preserve them as they currently exist. In the case of silk flags, such as this one, silk is a fabric that will essentially start to fall apart if you fold it, and you certainly don't want any sharp creases. So the best way to store these is flat. Now, given that a lot of them are quite large, storing all of them flat is often not an option. So in cases such as flags like this, we try to keep it stored as flat as possible, and we keep a archival plastic called mylar, which is one layer on top and one layer on bottom. And this allows us to store the flag on a flat panel so that when we pick it up, we're only picking up the panel itself and not the actual flag. And in the case of a flag that's a little bit too large to fit completely flat on a panel, the mylar gives it a nice gentle roll rather than a sharp crease. As we can see with this particular flag, the silk has a lot of previous damage to it. So up here, we can see that the silk has started to shatter and to disintegrate. And sometimes this is due to the way that the dye was applied to the fabric when it was first made. There's all kinds of chemicals and things and a wide variety of places where the silk came from and how it was treated. In this case, there's also a little bit of staining here on the flag itself. So the best we can do before having this taken to a professional textile conservator and having them begin their work is simply to keep it stored as carefully as possible in a stable environment. We are looking at a Virginia state flag that was carried by an unidentified Virginia regiment in the Civil War. Unfortunately, sometimes for those of us working in museums today, the work of conserving a flag begins with undoing the work that others may have done to the flag in the past. If you look at this flag closely, you'll notice that there is this kind of zigzag stitching all over the flag, which is most notable on the dark portions, but also goes right through this hand-painted seal. You'll also notice that there's kind of two different colors of blue fabric on the flag. There's a kind of a darker blue that then ends here on the far right side, and there's a much lighter blue, which then comprises the entire far right end of the flag. Back in the 1940s, a very well-meaning group of people who were the textile conservators of their day decided that this poor tattered flag needed to be fixed up and stabilized. And their method of doing that was to sew the remaining flag onto a backing that roughly approximated the color of the original flag, and then to run the entire thing back and forth through a sewing machine many, many times. We now know that this process is very invasive. Sewing machine needles tend to be fairly large, and they punched holes in the flag as they were doing all of that stitching, which is particularly problematic on the hand-sewn portions, where the needle also was passing through paint. So nowadays, what we would do is we would actually remove all of the sewing machine stitching from this flag, as well as to remove the backing fabric to which it has been attached, because we don't want the blue modern fabric to be possibly staining or discoloring the back of this Virginia state seal, or even any portions of the original flag itself. So this is a very painstaking process, and this is one level of conservation that we will actually do here at the museum in-house, because it can save quite a lot of time and money from the overall conservation process once we take it to the conservator. And it's a very sort of mentally and somewhat physically grueling process, because it involves taking a very tiny pair of scissors and a very tiny pair of tweezers and essentially cutting the sewing machine threads at the same point all the way across for each row of stitching, and then actually pulling them out. And you have to be very careful when you're doing it, because the goal is not to cut any of the original fibers of the flag, but only the modern sewing machine stitching. So because this was done in sort of a variety of ways, sometimes the best thing to do is to actually flip the flag over and cut out the stitching starting from the back side of the flag, And once you actually go through and cut a line of stitches, you will then flip the flag back over and very carefully pull all of them out. It's easier to work from the back of the flag sometimes also because the fabric that I'm working with here is the backing fabric, which is the modern fabric, not the original fabric of the flag. But simply removing the stitches row by row. Be somewhere in here. And a lot of times these threads are very brittle and are kind of almost dry rotting, so it's easy to kind of go in and pull them out. There we go. Start to get nice little runs of the stitches there that you can start to pull out. You've cut them all on the back. And so this becomes the first step of conserving a flag like this that's been treated in this way. Because once you get all of that done, then you can start to arrange and flatten all of the original portions of the flag and really start to get it back into the original shape. We try to be very cautious about the treatment methods which we employ to conserve any of these flags, because we want to really take a long-term approach to it and think through all of the possible implications of any given treatment method to ensure that what we're doing now is something that's not going to cause permanent harm to the item over time. We hope that people will want to learn a variety of things from the flag collection. The flags can certainly be viewed as works of art. There's a lot of artistry behind a lot of these, whether it's in the quality of the painting or the really beautiful way that they're sewn together. Knowing the sorts of things that people were fighting and in many cases dying for underneath these flags in a very literal way makes them very, very powerful sort of historic messengers to us.